What is more terrifying, to see a monster in your nightmares or to see it in the mirror every morning? For Charles II of Spain, the last scion of the Habsburgs, this was not a question, but a daily reality. His face was a living testament to a catastrophe centuries in the making, an enormous drooping jaw that prevented him from chewing properly, a tongue so large he could barely speak, and a mind teetering on the edge of darkness. His very existence was the final, agonizing scream of a dynasty that had devoured itself from within. This was not the work of a witch's curse or divine wrath. It was the predictable, mathematically precise result of a family strategy that had conquered a continent and then turned inward, consuming its own bloodline until only an echo of humanity remained. The story of the Habsburgs is not a tale of battles won with swords, but of a war lost in the bedroom. How did a family motto, a simple recipe for success, become a genetic death sentence for the most powerful house in Europe? To find the answer, we must journey back not to a dark and stormy night, but to a series of brilliant, sunlit weddings. It all began with a masterstroke of diplomacy and ambition, orchestrated by a man who dreamed of a world united under his family name, Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. His genius was not in warfare, but in matchmaking. He wielded wedding rings like weapons, conquering kingdoms without shedding a single drop of blood. His famous dictum, Bella gerant ali tu Felix Austria, nube, let others wage war, you happy Austria marry, became the dynasty's creed. And it worked with breathtaking efficiency. He secured the wealthy Burgundian inheritance, including the prosperous Netherlands, by marrying Mary of Burgundy. He then engineered a double marriage for his children, Philip the Handsome and Margaret, with the children of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. In a single generation, the Habsburgs had laid claim to Spain, its burgeoning New World empire, and the heart of Europe. They were no longer just Austrian archdukes, they were on the verge of global dominion. The formula was simple: consolidate, intermarry, and inherit. Keep the power, the wealth, and the blood within the family circle. The walls they built around their power were meant to keep enemies out, but they inadvertently created a prison for their own genes. The first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt in the story of Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who married Maximilian's son, Philip the Handsome. Known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, she was the first great crack in the dynasty's gilded facade. Her passion for her husband was legendary, but it curdled into an obsessive, destructive jealousy. Was it true madness, or the desperate reaction of a passionate woman trapped in a loveless political marriage? Philip was notoriously unfaithful, and each infidelity chipped away at her sanity. When he died suddenly at the age of 28, her grief was terrifying in its intensity. She refused to leave his coffin, traveling with his embalmed body across the Spanish countryside for months, a macabre procession that horrified her subjects. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her own son, Charles, used her instability as a pretext to seize power. They declared her unfit to rule and imprisoned her in a convent in Tordesillas for the rest of her long, tormented life. For nearly 50 years, the rightful Queen of Castile and Aragon was a prisoner of her own family, a ghost haunting the foundations of the empire her son was building. Her tragedy was a convenient political tool, but it was also a warning, a red flag fluttering over the magnificent Habsburg edifice. The madness that gripped Joanna was the first sign that the bloodline, so carefully guarded, was beginning to harbor its own demons. The dynasty dismissed it as a woman's hysteria, a tragic anomaly. They could not yet see that Joanna's mind was the first battlefield in a long war against an enemy they could not name, an enemy hidden in the very blood they prized above all else. They were so focused on the crowns and the titles that they failed to notice the subtle distortions in the portraits, the whispers of ill health in the royal nurseries. They were forging an empire of unprecedented scale, yet its architects were already carrying the seeds of its destruction. They built their house on a foundation of gold and power, but the mortar was a toxic mix of ambition and incest. Would you have dared to challenge this strategy, knowing it was the source of all your power? Was Joanna's fate a tragic injustice or a necessary sacrifice for the creation of a world empire? Tell us what you think was the greater crime, the political betrayal by her family or the personal betrayal by her husband. Your response in the comments will help us understand the moral calculus of power. The tragedy of Joanna the Mad was locked away behind convent walls, a dark secret at the heart of the sprawling empire. Her son, Charles, inherited it all: Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He became Charles V, the most powerful man in the world. The sun, it was said, never set on his domains. He was the embodiment of the Habsburg dream, a ruler who commanded vast armies and untold wealth from the silver mines of the New World. But with the crowns he also inherited the curse, a flaw that was now becoming physically manifest, impossible to hide. It was etched onto his very face in the form of the distinctive Habsburg jaw. This prominent, protruding lower jaw, a condition known as mandibular prognathism, was more than just an unflattering family trait. It was a genetic marker, a scarlet letter, branded onto the dynasty by its own marital practices. Charles's jaw was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth did not meet, making it difficult for him to chew his food. He often ate alone, hidden from the court, struggling with meals that had to be pre-cut into tiny pieces. This physical deformity was a constant source of discomfort and a visible symbol of a lineage that was beginning to turn in on itself. His parents, Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad, were first cousins. His grandparents were also closely related. The genetic pool was already shrinking, and Charles was the living proof. The emperor's life was one of relentless struggle, not just with his own body, but with the world he ruled. He was a devout Catholic, and his reign coincided with the explosion of the Protestant Reformation. He saw Martin Luther's 95 Theses not as a theological dispute, but as a direct challenge to his authority and the unity of Christendom. He spent decades waging war against the Protestant princes of Germany, a conflict that drained his treasury and his spirit. To the east, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was a constant threat, pushing into Hungary and laying siege to the very gates of Vienna. To the west, he fought a series of brutal wars against King Francis I of France, his great rival for supremacy in Europe. He was a man stretched to his breaking point, fighting on a dozen fronts at once, a global emperor in an age of slow communication and constant crisis. His physical ailments were a relentless torment. Beyond the trouble with his jaw, he suffered from crippling gout, a painful inflammation of the joints exacerbated by his rich diet. His hands and feet became so swollen and tender that he often had to be carried in a litter, unable to walk or even hold a pen. He was plagued by hemorrhoids, asthma, and chronic indigestion. These were not the noble wounds of a warrior king, but the mundane, humiliating betrayals of a body at war with itself. The Habsburgs built their dynasty with such meticulous care that they turned their own lineage into a prison from which there was no escape. They saw their unique features not as a sign of weakness, but as a mark of divine right, a royal brand. But it was the brand of a slow, creeping decay. Each successive generation, each new cousin marriage, would amplify the flaw, like an echo in a sealed chamber growing louder and more distorted, until it became a deafening roar. In his late 50s, a weary and broken man, Charles did the unthinkable. He abdicated. He gave up all his titles, renounced his power, and retreated to a small, secluded villa attached to the monastery of Yuste in a remote corner of Spain. It was a shocking act, a repudiation of the very ambition that had defined his life. He sought peace from the endless wars, the political intrigues, and the ceaseless pain of his own body. He spent his final years surrounded by clocks, obsessively trying to make them all strike at the same time, a poignant metaphor for his lifelong struggle to impose order on a chaotic world. But even in this final act, he ensured the dynasty's continuation, and with it, the curse. He split his vast inheritance, a decision that would have profound consequences. To his brother Ferdinand, he gave the Austrian lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. To his only legitimate son Philip, he bequeathed Spain, the Netherlands, and the immense empire in the Americas. In dividing the empire, he hoped to make it more governable, to save it from collapsing under its own weight. But he also divided the flawed inheritance of his blood. He created two major branches of the family, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. And it was in the isolated, fiercely Catholic kingdom of Spain that the genetic poison would concentrate with terrifying speed, culminating in a biological dead end. The division of the empire sealed the fate of the Spanish branch, while the Austrian Habsburgs continued to interact, albeit often through marriage, with other German and Italian houses. The Spanish line became a genetic island. Philip II, son of Charles V, inherited not only the richest part of the empire but also a double dose of its tainted legacy. His father, Charles, had married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Philip would take this practice to its extreme, turning the Spanish royal court into a laboratory for intense, systematic inbreeding. He was a man profoundly different from his globe-trotting father. Where Charles was a medieval knight who led his armies in person, Philip was a modern bureaucrat, a king who ruled the world from a small, dark office, armed with pen and paper. He was the prudent king, cautious, meticulous, and deeply, fanatically religious. He saw himself as the sword of the Catholic Church, the defender of the faith against the Protestant heretics of the north and the Muslim infidels of the south. His reign was marked by the brutal suppression of the Dutch revolt, a long and bloody war that would drain Spain's resources for 80 years. He launched the Invincible Armada against Protestant England, a colossal military disaster that marked the beginning of the end of Spanish naval supremacy. He was a spider at the center of a global web, his threads of influence reaching every corner of the known world. And at the heart of that web, he built his lair, the royal monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial. This immense, forbidding granite palace built in the desolate foothills near Madrid was more than a residence. It was a monastery, a library, a mausoleum, and a fortress. Its severe, grid-like design reflected the king's own rigid, ascetic, and paranoid personality. The Escorial was the physical embodiment of Philip's Spain, austere, pious, and turned inward against a hostile world. It was here, in these cold, dark corridors, that the genetic tragedy of the Habsburgs would play out its most Gothic act. Philip's marital history is a chilling catalogue of consanguinity. His first wife was his double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. His second, Queen Mary I of England, was his father's first cousin. After her death, he married Elizabeth of Valois of France for political reasons, a rare outcrossing. But for his fourth and final marriage, he returned to the family fold, taking as his bride Anna of Austria, who was not only his first cousin, but also his niece. She was the daughter of his sister Maria. This union of uncle and niece was the one that would produce his long-awaited male heir, Philip III, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty and its curse. But the most haunting story from Philip's reign is that of his firstborn son, Don Carlos, the product of his first doubly incestuous marriage. From birth, Don Carlos was physically frail and mentally unstable. He had a deformed spine and a pronounced stutter. As he grew, his behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He reportedly roasted animals alive, blinded the horses in the royal stables, and once forced a shoemaker to eat a pair of shoes he had made too tightly. His cruelty was matched only by his rebellion against his father. He made contact with the rebels in the Netherlands, a treasonous act in Philip's eyes. The king, convinced his son was a danger to the state and to himself, made a terrible decision. He had Don Carlos arrested and confined to his chambers in the castle of Madrid. 6 months later, the 23-year-old prince was dead. The official cause was his own reckless behavior, binging on rotten fruit and ice water, but rumors have swirled for centuries that Philip ordered his own son's murder. The story of Don Carlos became a dark legend, immortalized in Schiller's play and Verdi's opera, a symbol of the ultimate clash between a tyrannical father and a doomed son. But at its heart, it was a biological tragedy. Don Carlos was the first clear victim of the dynasty's fatal strategy, a mind and body broken by generations of inbreeding. In the gloomy halls of the Escorial, Philip II mourned his son, buried his wives, and meticulously managed his empire, all while unknowingly tightening the genetic noose around his family's neck. He believed he was preserving the purity of his Catholic bloodline. In reality, he was creating a monster that would one day sit on his throne. The death of Philip II marked the end of Spain's golden age, though the gold and silver from the Americas continued to pour in for a time, masking the deep decay that was setting in. His successors, Philip III and Philip IV, presided over a slow, inexorable decline. The dynasty that had once bestrode the world like a colossus was now stumbling, weakened not by foreign enemies, but by the hollowness within. This was the age of mediocrity, when the reins of power slipped from the hands of kings into the grip of their favorites, the powerful chief ministers known as validos. Philip III, the son of Philip II's marriage to his niece Anna, was a man of little ambition and deep, almost debilitating piety. He spent his days in prayer and court ceremony, leaving the difficult business of governing to the Duke of Lerma. Under Lerma's corrupt rule, the court became a swamp of intrigue and extravagance, while the Spanish economy stagnated and its armies suffered defeats. The Habsburgs had built an empire that required giants to run it, but their own policies were now producing pygmies. The family's genetic inheritance was a lottery where every ticket was a losing one. The next king, Philip IV, was a more complex and tragic figure. He had more energy and intelligence than his father, but he too was unable to halt the slide. He inherited the throne at 16 and quickly handed over power to his own favorite, the ambitious Count Duke of Olivares, who fruitlessly attempted to reform the empire and restore its former glory. Philip's reign was one of unmitigated disaster, catastrophic defeats in the 30 Years' War, the secession of Portugal, and a massive rebellion in Catalonia. The great Spanish Empire was crumbling, yet paradoxically, this period of political and military collapse coincided with an unparalleled explosion of artistic genius. It was the Siglo de Oro, the golden century of Spanish art, and its brightest star was the court painter Diego Velázquez. Velázquez, with his penetrating gaze and unparalleled skill, became the unwitting chronicler of the Habsburgs' genetic decline. His portraits of Philip IV and his family are masterpieces of world art, but they are also invaluable medical documents. In his canvases we see the Habsburg jaw becoming ever more pronounced, the eyes heavier, the expression more melancholic. Velázquez did not flatter. He painted what he saw with a stark, uncompromising realism. He painted the king, his brother, the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, and his son, the heir to the throne, Balthazar Charles. The portraits of the young prince are particularly heartbreaking. We see him as a vibrant, hopeful child, dressed in hunting gear or riding a pony, the future of the empire resting on his small shoulders. But Velázquez's brush captures the telltale signs, the elongated face, the slightly vacant stare. The hopes of the dynasty were pinned on this boy, but at the age of 16, Balthazar Charles died suddenly, likely from smallpox. His death was a devastating blow to the king and the kingdom. Philip IV was left without a male heir. Desperate to secure the succession, the aging king made a fateful decision. His first wife had died, and he needed to remarry immediately. The chosen bride was the most logical and the most dangerous candidate, his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was the daughter of his sister Maria Anna and the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III. At the time of the marriage, she was 13 years old. He was 44. This union between an uncle and his young niece, who were already first cousins, represented the final desperate turning of the genetic screw. It was this marriage that would produce the last and most blighted of the Spanish Habsburgs. Velázquez's final masterpiece, Las Meninas, is a haunting group portrait set in the artist's studio. At its center is the young princess, the Infanta Margarita Teresa. a child of this new union. She is surrounded by her maids of honor, her dwarf, and a dog. In the background, reflected in a mirror, are the ghostly images of her parents, the king and queen. It is a complex, enigmatic painting, a meditation on art, reality, and illusion. But it is also a family portrait of a dynasty on the brink of extinction. The charming little princess, with her pale skin and solemn expression, was yet another carrier of the family's toxic legacy. Velázquez, the king's loyal servant, had, without intending to, created the most damning evidence of all. His art showed the world the truth that the Habsburgs themselves refused to see. Their pursuit of purity was leading them to oblivion. The splendor of the art was a beautiful shroud for a dying lineage. So, who bears more responsibility for this decline, the kings who were too weak to rule, or the ministers who usurped their power for personal gain? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. While the Spanish branch of the family was spiraling into a genetic vortex, their Austrian cousins were busy setting the continent ablaze. They too practiced consanguineous marriage, though with slightly more variety, weaving Bavarian and Italian noble houses into their tapestry. The curse was diluted, but it was still present, manifesting not so much in grotesque physical deformity as in a rigid, unyielding mindset that would plunge Germany into one of the most brutal wars in human history. The 30 Years' War, a conflict that lasted from 1618 to 1648, was a maelstrom of religious fanaticism, political ambition, and pure carnage. And at its heart were the Austrian Habsburg emperors, Ferdinand II and his son, Ferdinand III. They were men forged in the crucible of the Counter-Reformation, consumed by a militant Catholic faith that left no room for compromise. Ferdinand II, in particular, was a man who believed he was on a divine mission to eradicate Protestantism from the Holy Roman Empire. It was his intolerance and his violation of the religious freedoms of his Bohemian subjects that triggered the initial revolt, the infamous defenestration of Prague, where Protestant nobles threw the emperor's representatives out of a castle window. This act lit the fuse on a powder keg that would explode across Central Europe. The war was a conflict of shocking brutality. Armies of mercenaries fighting not for a nation, but for a paycheck, crisscrossed Germany, leaving a trail of devastation. Cities were besieged, sacked, and burned. Famine and plague followed in the soldiers' wake. Entire regions were depopulated. Some estimates suggest that the population of the German lands was reduced by a third. It was a total war where the distinction between combatant and civilian dissolved in a tide of blood. What drove the Habsburg emperors to pursue this war with such relentless, self-destructive obstinacy? Their religious zeal was certainly a factor, but their actions were also shaped by the characteristic Habsburg stubbornness, an inflexibility of mind that may well have been amplified by their constricted gene pool. They saw compromise not as a tool of statecraft, but as a moral failing, a sin against God. They were incapable of seeing the world from their opponent's perspective. Their worldview was as rigid and unchanging as the Spanish court etiquette. The great tragedy of the age is that this mediocre dynasty was served by a man of genuine, terrifying genius, Albrecht von Wallenstein, a minor Bohemian nobleman who rose to become the supreme commander of the imperial armies. Wallenstein was a military and logistical mastermind. He raised vast private armies loyal only to him and won a series of stunning victories for the emperor. But he was also ambitious, enigmatic, and politically pragmatic. He understood that the war could not be won outright and sought a negotiated peace that would create a new balance of power in Germany, with himself at its center. His ambition and his willingness to negotiate with the Protestant enemy made the deeply paranoid Ferdinand II suspicious. The emperor came to see his most brilliant general as a traitor. In 1634, on the emperor's orders, Wallenstein was assassinated by his own officers in the town of Eger. The murder of Wallenstein was a pivotal moment. The Habsburgs had eliminated a perceived rival, but they had also destroyed the one man who might have been able to bring the catastrophic war to a successful conclusion. They had chosen ideological purity over pragmatic victory. It was a decision born of the same mindset that led them to choose pure blood over healthy heirs. The war dragged on for another 14 years, a meaningless slaughter that bled the empire dry. By the time the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, the emperor's power was broken, and the dream of a unified Catholic Germany was dead forever. The war was a mirror of the dynasty's own internal state, a chaotic, self-consuming conflict that left only ruins in its wake. The madness that had once been confined to the mind of a single queen had now been unleashed upon an entire continent. The Habsburgs sought to impose their rigid order on the world, but they succeeded only in creating chaos, their personal fixations writ large in the language of fire and steel. They had proven that the most dangerous prison is not one with stone walls, but the prison of a closed mind. Back in Madrid, the final act of the Spanish tragedy was beginning. The child born of the union between Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria was a boy named Charles. From the moment of his birth in 1661, he was not a hope, but a horror. He was the culmination of 2 centuries of incest, a living monument to the dynasty's folly. His genetic makeup was a catastrophe. Modern scientists have calculated his inbreeding coefficient to be 0.254, a figure higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. He was more inbred than an animal from a breeder's prize-winning line, but he displayed none of the desired traits, only the accumulated defects. He was the sum of all their fears, the curse made flesh. His list of ailments was staggering. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. He did not speak until he was 4. His Habsburg jaw was so extreme that his 2 rows of teeth could not meet at all, and he drooled constantly. He could barely chew his food, which was often swallowed whole, leading to constant stomach upsets. He was prone to fevers and convulsions. He suffered from rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, which left his legs weak and bowed. He was, by all accounts, mentally disabled, prone to fits of rage and long periods of listless apathy. He was the king of the world's largest empire, but he remained a perpetual, sickly child. The court that surrounded him was a scene of desperation and medieval superstition. The Spanish elite could not, or would not, understand that their king was the product of their own breeding practices. Instead, they sought supernatural explanations. The king was not ill, he was bewitched. He was the victim of a demonic curse. And so the battle for the king's body began. It was a grotesque struggle waged not by generals, but by an army of doctors, charlatans, alchemists, and priests. The finest physicians of Europe were summoned to the palace, and each proposed their own torturous remedies. They prescribed foul-smelling potions made from herbs and crushed minerals. They subjected the frail king to enemas, purges, and bloodlettings that left him even weaker. One treatment involved placing the mummified remains of saints in his bed, in the hope that their holiness would seep into him and effect a cure. When medicine failed, the court turned to the church. Exorcists were brought in to drive out the demons that they believed possessed the king. They performed elaborate rituals, chanting in Latin, sprinkling holy water, and demanding that the evil spirits reveal themselves. One particularly zealous inquisitor forced the king to swallow potions containing blessed water and olive oil, and to look at relics while reciting prayers. He even ordered the exorcism of the entire royal palace, from the kitchens to the throne room. These terrifying ceremonies only served to frighten the simple-minded king, who became convinced that he was indeed possessed by the devil. He was a prisoner in his own palace, his body a testing ground for the most extreme and bizarre theories of his time. The central, agonizing question that haunted the court was the succession. Charles needed to produce an heir to save the dynasty from extinction. He was married twice, first to the French princess Marie-Louise of Orléans, and after her death to the German princess Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both marriages were childless. The king was likely impotent, a final, cruel joke played by his own genetics. The attempts to make him conceive were as bizarre as the attempts to cure him. He was fed supposed aphrodisiacs and subjected to rituals designed to enhance his virility. His confessors would question him relentlessly about his efforts in the marital bed, turning the most intimate act into a matter of state security and religious duty. Charles II was not a king, he was a living relic, a symbol of the agony of his line. His court was a theatre of the absurd, a place where science and superstition clashed over the broken body of one man, while the fate of an empire hung in the balance. The Habsburgs had sought a purity of blood so absolute that they had created its opposite, a vessel of weakness and disease. Their quest for divine right had led them to a biological dead end, a place where prayers were useless and the only devil was the one lurking in their own DNA. The court of Charles II, known to his people as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was a place of paralysis and decay. With the king a virtual invalid, incapable of making any coherent decision, Spain drifted like a rudderless galleon, laden with the treasures of empire but heading straight for the rocks. The country was ruled by a succession of competing factions: the Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, a dour and domineering woman who fought to maintain her influence, a series of aristocratic cliques who schemed for power and plundered the state treasury, and the king's two foreign wives who acted as agents for their home countries. The government of the once mighty Spanish Empire was reduced to a squabble in a sick room. The consequences for Spain were disastrous. The economy, already burdened by endless wars and a rigid, uncompetitive structure, collapsed. The silver from the Americas, which had financed Habsburg ambitions for 2 centuries, began to decline. The military, once the most feared in Europe, was a shadow of its former self, its soldiers unpaid, its ships rotting in port. Spain was a colossus on feet of clay, and the vultures were circling. The great powers of Europe watched the slow-motion death of the Spanish king with greedy anticipation. They were not concerned for the fate of the Spanish people, they were interested in the inheritance. The Spanish Empire was the richest prize in the world, encompassing not only Spain itself, but also the southern Netherlands, vast territories in Italy, the Philippines, and the immense continent-spanning colonies in the Americas. The question of who would inherit this vast domain became the single most important issue in international politics. The two main claimants were, ironically, both relatives of Charles, products of the same tangled web of Habsburg marriages. The first was the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I in Vienna. As a fellow Habsburg, he claimed the inheritance for his younger son, the Archduke Charles. The second and more powerful claimant was the mighty King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His wife, Maria Theresa, was Charles II's older half-sister. Through her, Louis claimed the Spanish throne for his grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou. A union of the French and Spanish crowns under the Bourbon dynasty would create a superpower that would shatter the balance of power in Europe, a prospect that terrified England and the Dutch Republic. The Madrid court transformed into a nest of vipers, a hotbed of espionage and intrigue. The French and Austrian ambassadors waged a relentless war of influence, bribing Spanish grandees, spreading rumors, and desperately trying to sway the feeble-minded king. They plotted with the queens, the confessors, the doctors, anyone who had access to the royal ear. Secret treaties were drafted between the European powers, carving up the Spanish Empire before its king was even dead, like ghoulish relatives dividing a rich man's estate at his deathbed. Charles himself was no longer a player in this monstrous game, he was the prize. He was paraded on state occasions, a pathetic, shambling figure to prove that he was still alive. His moods and his health were monitored daily by a network of spies who sent coded reports back to Paris and Vienna. Would he survive the winter? Did he favor the French faction today? Had the Austrian ambassador gained his confidence? His every utterance, often incoherent, was analyzed for hidden meaning. The fate of millions of people, the future of continents, hinged on the whim of a man who could barely control his own body. It was a macabre spectacle, the personal tragedy of one man amplified into a global crisis. The dynasty that had been built on marital alliances was now being torn apart by them. The very strategy that had given the Habsburgs the world was now inviting the world to come and tear their inheritance to pieces. The final years of the 17th century were a period of tense, anxious waiting. All of Europe held its breath, waiting for the bewitched king to die. Which side would you have supported in this shadowy war for influence? The Austrian faction, seeking to keep the crown within the Habsburg family, or the French faction, representing a new and powerful dynasty? Let us know what choice you would make at the dawn of a new century. The end came on November 1st, 1700. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died at the age of 38, his body finally surrendering after a lifetime of struggle. The autopsy report was a litany of horrors. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines putrefactive, and his head full of water. His death, however, did not bring peace. It brought the opposite. It brought war. In the final weeks of his life, under intense pressure from the pro-French faction at court, Charles had been persuaded to sign a new will. It named as his sole heir the grandson of Louis XIV, Philip, Duke of Anjou. The will stipulated that the Spanish Empire must remain intact, a direct repudiation of the partition treaties secretly agreed upon by the other European powers. When the news reached Versailles, Louis XIV made a momentous decision. He accepted the will on behalf of his grandson, famously declaring, "Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées," there are no more Pyrenees. The dream of a Bourbon superstate uniting France and Spain was now a reality. Europe exploded. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold, refused to accept the will and immediately declared war to claim the Spanish inheritance for his own son. He was quickly joined by England and the Dutch Republic, who saw the union of the French and Spanish crowns as an existential threat to their trade and security. Thus began the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would rage for over a decade and engulf the entire continent, from the fields of Flanders to the shores of the Mediterranean. It was the first true world war of the modern era, with battles fought not only in Europe but also in North America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War. The war was fought not for a living, breathing empire, but for its rich and sprawling corpse. A French historian aptly called it the War for the Spanish Cemetery. The dynasty built on marriages met its final, bloody end in a storm of steel. The conflict saw the rise of two of the greatest military commanders in history who fought in alliance against the French, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, for England, and Prince Eugene of Savoy for the Holy Roman Empire. They were a brilliant partnership, a combination of daring and strategic genius that inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the previously invincible armies of Louis XIV. The names of their victories, Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, became legendary. These were battles on an epic scale involving tens of thousands of soldiers, fought with musket, bayonet, and cannon, and resulting in casualty rates that were shocking even for that brutal age. While the great powers battled for control of Italy and the Netherlands, Spain itself was consumed by a vicious civil war. The region of Castile largely accepted the Bourbon king Philip V, but Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia rose up in support of the Austrian claimant, the Archduke Charles, whom they hailed as King Charles III. The war in the Iberian Peninsula was a bitter, savage affair, marked by sieges, guerrilla warfare, and brutal reprisals. The city of Barcelona, a bastion of pro-Austrian sentiment, was eventually captured and stripped of its traditional rights and freedoms, an act of vengeance that has left scars on the Spanish political landscape to this day. After more than a decade of bloodshed that left hundreds of thousands dead, the exhausted combatants finally came to the negotiating table. The series of treaties, known as the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, brought the conflict to an end. It was a classic European compromise. Philip V was recognized as the King of Spain, thus establishing the Bourbon dynasty that rules the country to this day. But he was forced to renounce any claim to the French throne, preventing the union of the two kingdoms. In return for this concession, the Spanish Empire was dismembered. Austria received most of Spain's Italian possessions and the Spanish Netherlands. Great Britain, the real winner of the war, gained Gibraltar and Minorca, key strategic naval bases, as well as the lucrative right to supply slaves to the Spanish colonies. The Habsburg Empire in Spain was dead, carved up and distributed among the victors. The great house that had dominated Europe for 2 centuries had vanished from the Spanish throne, not with a dignified fade, but with the roar of cannons and the screams of dying men. Their relentless pursuit of genetic purity had ultimately led to the greatest irony of all. Their throne was now occupied by their oldest and bitterest enemies. While the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg was immolating itself in a blaze of war and genetic collapse, the Austrian branch endured. They had lost the Spanish crown, but they still ruled a vast, multilingual empire in the heart of Europe, encompassing Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and parts of Italy and the Balkans. Yet, they too faced the same existential threat that had destroyed their Spanish cousins, a failure of the male line. Emperor Charles VI, who had been the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne during the war, had no sons. His only surviving child was a daughter, Maria Theresa. In the deeply patriarchal world of 18th century Europe, the idea of a female ruler was radical and, to many, unacceptable. Determined to secure his daughter's inheritance and prevent another catastrophic succession war, Charles spent most of his reign persuading the various powers of Europe to accept a decree he called the Pragmatic Sanction. This document set aside the traditional Salic law that barred female succession and declared his lands to be indivisible and inseparable, to be passed down to his daughter. He secured agreements from nearly every major state, often at a high price in diplomatic and territorial concessions. It was all for nothing. When Charles VI died in 1740, his ink was barely dry on the treaties before they were ignored. Frederick the Great of Prussia, a new and aggressive power on the European stage, immediately invaded the rich Austrian province of Silesia. France, Bavaria, and Saxony joined in, each hoping to carve a piece from the Habsburg inheritance. The War of the Austrian Succession had begun, and the young, inexperienced Maria Theresa found herself fighting for her very survival. But Maria Theresa was no Charles II. She proved to be one of the most formidable rulers of her time, courageous, determined, and pragmatic. She rallied her Hungarian subjects in a famous scene, appearing before their parliament with her infant son in her arms, and won their crucial military support. Though she ultimately lost Silesia to Prussia, she successfully defended the rest of her empire and secured the imperial throne for her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine. More importantly, Maria Theresa seemed to understand, perhaps intuitively, the danger that had destroyed her Spanish relatives. Her marriage to Francis Stephen was a love match, but it was also a crucial genetic outcrossing. She broke the cycle of close inbreeding. Together they had 16 children, an astonishing number that repopulated the dynasty and injected new vitality into its tired bloodline. They founded the new House of Habsburg-Lorraine, which would rule the Austrian Empire until its final collapse. But was the curse truly overcome, or did it simply lie dormant, waiting for a new opportunity to manifest? The fate of Maria Theresa's children suggests that the ghosts of the past were not so easily banished. Her youngest daughter, Maria Antonia, would be sent to France to marry the future King Louis XVI. We know her as Marie Antoinette. Her tragic end on the guillotine during the French Revolution seemed to many like a cruel echo of the Habsburg fate, a life of privilege ending in violent destruction. Another son, Emperor Joseph II, was a brilliant and tireless reformer, an enlightened despot, but his frantic attempts to modernize his empire often backfired, and he died a bitter and disappointed man. The Habsburg legacy was not confined to Europe. In the New World, the centuries of their rule had created a rigid social hierarchy based on blood and race, a system of feudal exploitation that long outlived the empire itself. The vast inequalities and political instability that would plague Latin America for generations were, in many ways, the ghosts of the Habsburg imperial system. Maria Theresa had saved the dynasty from immediate extinction. She had renewed its blood and reformed its state. but the house she rebuilt still stood on old, unstable foundations. The world was changing, swept by the new forces of nationalism, liberalism, and revolution. The Habsburgs, with their belief in divine right and their sprawling multi-ethnic empire, were beginning to look like relics of a bygone age. The dynasty had survived, but it was now living on borrowed time. The 19th century was a long, slow retreat for the House of Habsburg. Under the steady conservative hand of Emperor Franz Joseph, who reigned for a remarkable 68 years, the Austrian, later Austro-Hungarian, empire survived the Napoleonic Wars, the revolutions of 1848, and the rise of Prussia. But it was an empire creaking under the strain of its own contradictions. It was a multinational state in an age of fervent nationalism, a dynastic inheritance in an age of democracy. It was held together by the glue of tradition, the bureaucracy and the army, but beneath the surface, the resentments of its many peoples, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Serbs, Croats, were simmering. The shadows of the old family curse seemed to gather once more around the imperial family, manifesting now not as physical deformity, but as a relentless series of personal tragedies. The emperor's brother Maximilian was installed as Emperor of Mexico by the French and was executed by a Republican firing squad. The emperor's only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, a man of liberal ideas at odds with his conservative father, died in a mysterious murder-suicide pact with his young mistress at the Meiling hunting lodge. The emperor's beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, the beautiful and mercurial Sisi, was assassinated by an Italian anarchist. It was as if a dark fate was methodically stripping away the pillars of the emperor's world, leaving him an isolated, lonely old man, a symbol of a dying era. The final blow came on June 28, 1914. In the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie. The Archduke, a nephew of the emperor, was a difficult and irascible man, but his death provided the spark that the Austro-Hungarian War Party needed. Fueled by a century of imperial frustration and a rigid, Habsburg-like inability to compromise, Vienna issued an unacceptable ultimatum to Serbia. When it was rejected, they declared war. Within weeks, the complex system of European alliances clicked into place, dragging the great powers one by one into the abyss. The First World War had begun. The war was the final catastrophe for the Habsburgs. Their antiquated, multi-ethnic army was shattered on the Eastern Front and in the Alps. The empire, starved and exhausted by 4 years of brutal conflict, simply disintegrated in the autumn of 1918. Its various nationalities declared their independence, and the ancient monarchy collapsed. The last emperor, Charles I, a grandnephew of Franz Joseph, was forced into exile, dying of pneumonia a few years later on the island of Madeira. After more than 600 years, the reign of the House of Habsburg was over. Their story, which for centuries had been shrouded in superstition and whispers of witchcraft, could now finally be understood. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the science of genetics provided the final, definitive verdict. Researchers studied the Habsburg family tree, a complex knot of intermarriage. They analyzed the historical accounts of their physical and mental ailments. They used computer models to calculate the inbreeding coefficients, confirming the devastatingly high levels in the Spanish line. The science was clear and unforgiving. The Habsburg curse was not a curse at all. It was the predictable outcome of recessive alleles. The consistent pairing of related individuals dramatically increased the chances that harmful recessive genes, normally masked in the wider population, would meet and express themselves. The famous jaw, the epilepsy, the infant mortality, the infertility, the mental disabilities, they were all the logical consequences of a deliberate, sustained program of incest, practiced in the name of power. The Habsburgs had treated their bloodline like a royal treasure, to be guarded and kept pure at all costs, but in doing so they turned it into a poison. Their story stands as the ultimate historical warning against the perils of pride and the belief that any family, no matter how powerful, can place itself above the fundamental laws of biology. They were the architects of their own destruction, a dynasty that committed a slow, agonizing, centuries-long suicide. Their quest for absolute control ended in absolute collapse, a lesson written in the grim language of genetics. Today, as humanity stands on the cusp of a new era, with the power of genetic engineering offering us control over our own evolution that the Habsburgs could only have dreamed of, their cautionary tale has never been more relevant. It forces us to ask a profound question about our own future. Will we learn from their hubris? We're at a crossroads. Tell us in the comments what path you believe humanity should take. Should we embrace modification to perfect our species, or should we trust in the wisdom of nature and accept our beautiful imperfections? Your opinion on this is more important than ever.